It now gives me great pleasure to introduce the Right Honourable Chris Skidmore MP, OBE and author of the Government's Independent Review of Net Zero, and Chair of the Mission Zero Coalition. And he'll give a presentation called The Need for International Collaboration Together with Healthy Competition Towards the Shared Goal of Decarbonisation and Environmental Sustainability. Ladies and gentlemen, Chris Skidmore.
Well, thank you, John, for that inspiring opening keynote. Hard to match, but I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation to address this conference today. If you told me 4.5 years ago, when I was the UK's energy minister, I had this opportunity to sign this thing called Net Zero into law. The UK became the first G7 country to do so. We actually beat France by a single day, not that that had anything to do with it. We then secured COP26 on the back of this so-called net zero commitment. I wouldn't have believed you 4 years on at the progress that has been made globally. 93% of global GDP represented 80% of all nations across the world have signed up to a net zero commitment of some form. The reality is in the past 4 years, and you know this as businesses and industry, the pace of change has escalated rapidly. Not only has net zero gone viral, there is no future economy without a green economy. Decisions are being made now in boardrooms across the globe about where to place future investment decisions. And those investment decisions are increasingly now not being made in the fossil fuels of the past, but in the industries and the technologies of the future, those that represent the opportunity to decarbonize and bring forwards future sustainability. And when I had the opportunity, I was asked by the then Prime Minister, Liz Truss, to review net zero in a way that was more affordable, sort of more efficient, pro-business and pro-growth. I think she had a slightly separate agenda on her mind when she set up this net zero review, but I'd spent the past year in Parliament having sort of brought net zero into law to defend net zero, to put sort of guardrails around it. And when it was the Conservative leadership contest, I was determined to ensure that every candidate, for what it was worth, looking back now, committed to net zero. I was worried that they would end up on the cutting room floor, that there would be some sort of race to the bottom, and that it would end up being part of a culture war, which clearly, we risk having that still happen, and we must all work together to stop it from gaining traction. And one of the reasons why I've come here today is to talk about the collaboration between policy and industry and business and how we can send out a consistent and clear message about what is needed to not only defend net zero, but get the investments that we need to be able to ensure that we can scale up as soon as possible. But Liz Truss departed the scene, and actually the net zero review was the one thing I think that actually remained from her government. I would say like a rare Edward VIII sort of coin. Sort of her time in government was marked by the Net Zero Review, and that was published in January of this year. 340-page document that I've now got coming out as a book. So I just wanted to advertise that to say, if you're interested in sort of looking at what needs to happen in the UK, the review set out 129 recommendations for how we can achieve net zero further, faster. But above all, the central narrative of the review, the Mission Zero report, was that net zero is an economic opportunity that we must seize with both hands now. Indeed, it is the economic opportunity of our generation, the chance to bring it to £1 trillion worth of inward investment, the chance to secure 480,000 new additional jobs by 2035, if we so wish. But at the same time, recognizing that the rest of the world has woken up to this opportunity. Yes, as John said, we were climate leaders. We still are climate leaders in that we are the #1 G20 country to have decarbonized further, faster than anyone else, 50% emissions reduction on 1990 levels, and at the same time as growing our economy on 1990 levels by 70%, we can hold up a paragon and a model of clean growth. And when I signed net zero into law, it wasn't some kind of woke eco project, some hair shirt initiative that was going to make people colder or poorer. The intention of delivering net zero and a pathway for 2050 was not only to ensure we maintained our climate commitments to achieve a limit of 1.5 degrees global warming, but at the same time recognise that we could create new jobs. We can ensure that this transition that needs to happen, and is going to happen anyway, whether politicians like it or not, that we could make sure that communities were protected. We could ensure that households didn't face a cost burden. Overwhelmingly, the cost of net zero, and obviously there is an upfront capital cost, will be made by yourselves in the private sector because you recognise the investment opportunities, the rates of return. And we need to talk more about those net zero narratives and stories. Everyone in this room is in their own way an author of their own net zero story. I see, having gone around the country with the Net Zero Review, countless examples of how communities and regions are getting on with it. And Westminster and Whitehall are behind the curve. Even in my own city that I represent down in Bristol, Bristol City Council has just signed a public-private partnership with Ameresco, a Boston company from the US. It's £7 million worth of public investment, crowding in £424 million of private investment. Of course, there's a rate of return for Ameresco. They wouldn't be doing it otherwise. But to recognise there are new ways of doing business that means net zero is a growth opportunity that will make us warmer through better energy insulation, district heating networks, which is what Ameresco is fitting for Bristol City Council, not colder and poorer. And I've come here today to ask yourselves to help politicians like myself set out those narrative stories. Because when you're standing in the House of Commons or when you're in front of the media, it's really difficult, as a politician sometimes to communicate what the energy transition can mean. You get your gigawatts and your megawatts mixed up sometimes. The cost of energy, the cost of electricity can be confusing. You might mix the two up. What you need is human stories, and human stories about how business is creating, as John said, wealth. It is creating jobs on the back of the transition. And that is a narrative that we all have a responsibility to get out and sell, not just here in London, but in all your sort of local, regional papers. We have a general election next year. We actually have two sets of elections potentially that are really important because obviously we have the general election where whoever forms the next administration, and I took forward the Net Zero Review, and while I've been a Conservative MP for 14 years, I took my independence very seriously. I met with the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats, the SNP, the Greens, the Scottish Government to talk through what is needed, because ultimately carbon dioxide emissions is colour-blind when it comes to party politics. And when we look at what happens on the net zero pathway, there will be several governments coming in and out of power. There's going to be 5 American presidential elections. We've got to make sure, regardless of which political party is in charge, that they are held to account for delivering on our climate commitments. The government that is coming into power in 2024 will be the government that sees whether we succeed on our heat pump target of 600,000 heat pumps by 2028. And that government will see whether we succeed in meeting our ZEV mandate. Because what's quite interesting when it comes to politicians, you often see politicians' rhetoric and their talk is very different from the action they take forwards. And actually, this government, I think, is guilty of so-called green hushing. I'm sure you're probably familiar with this term. On the one hand, they're talking about sort of slowing down net zero, rowing back, making net zero more proportionate, which in itself is a completely false narrative, because net zero was always proportionate. We need to make commitments to 2030, not just kicking the can down to 2050, but recognising that whoever forms this next government will also be responsible for meeting our commitment to the rest of the world, our national determined contribution of 68% emissions reduction by 2030. And obviously, globally, we need to have a 50% emissions reduction. And in 2 weeks' time, the rest of the world will be meeting in Dubai at COP28. Maybe some of you will be attending, but this COP is the first time that we will have a global stocktake. So at Glasgow, everyone's set out their national determined contributions, their ambition, their commitments. Now they're having their homework marked. And we don't quite know what will happen next, because the Paris Agreement is actually silent about what happens once this global stocktake has taken place. Increasingly, however, as John said, it is business and industry that is stepping up. We've had 28 COPs, and still the total amount, there is more CO2 that has been emitted in the past 28 years than the rest of history put together. And that's a stark reminder that, yes, we are bending our emissions curve downwards, and some really encouraging news from the IEA, International Energy Authority, that we are at peak carbon dioxide emissions potentially by 2025. China powering ahead, produce more renewable energy than the entire use of the UK this year alone. Investment in solar is now on a par with oil and gas, whereas 10 years ago, oil and gas investment was 6 times that of solar. You know, we are living in revolutionary times. You know, we are properly on that steep S of the S curve. And that the challenge I think we face is that, you know, for me, it's so frustrating that politicians are behind the curve. What is going on in those boardrooms around the country, those investment decisions mean that if we don't make the change, you know, there are communities up in Aberdeen, in Scotland, that through no fault of their own are working in oil and gas, you know, highly skilled engineers and technicians. It's not their fault that they're working in high carbon industries that we need. And obviously there is a net zero pathway, which means there always will be a use of oil and gas, but we don't need new additional oil fields that investors will struggle to invest in when they want to invest instead in renewable technologies, in clean power. And the challenge for us is linking this all up, recognizing that, you know, yes, we're an island, but we're not going to be able to succeed on our net zero journey without developing that future collaboration. Collaborations that are emerging at COP. So I know obviously the Net Zero Nations Project Conference and the Net Zero Club focuses on transport, it focuses on the built environment, on new low-carbon sustainable buildings. There's going to be a buildings breakthrough mission that is launched by France and Morocco. The details of that will be published, I think, on the 6th of December. Yeah, we are moving now away from these vertical silos of nation states towards horizontal opportunities, because that's where the dial really shifts. You know, if we can decarbonize steel, if we can decarbonize concrete, if we can decarbonize our energy-intensive industries, that's where we see the shift happen. In the Net Zero Review, I think one of the most stark statistic for me was that 8% of all our business and industry is responsible for 80% of our gas use. So sometimes the challenge in net zero is the media and everyone wants to sort of throw in everything in one go. And the reason why we have a net zero pathway is because we need to prioritize and do the hard things first, because sometimes getting on with the hard things means there's a time lag of sometimes up to 30 years, you know, before we really see the shift in the dial. But the opportunity to create international collaboration, to recognize there are emerging carbon markets. You know, we've had the emissions trading scheme in the UK. We were the pioneers, we set that up. We should have been carried on, you know, pioneering a carbon border adjustment mechanism. Actually, that's now the EU's taken that forward. That will start from January next year. Turkey have now said they will also have a carbon border adjustment mechanism. Regardless of what government's doing, business and industry recognize the tessellated pieces are coming together and that we will have carbon trading for the future. That will mean an association of low carbon products with quality. We can't outcompete China on low carbon steel and other goods. Our role in the UK is to recognize that the future of our economy is not only in delivering on our net zero commitments, but on those new jobs and growth that will be associated with the green industries that in themselves will be associated with quality. And to end, John also mentioned standards. And I think this is often overlooked because, you know, we have been the arbiter of standards, not just when it comes to our climate commitments, but when we look at the rest of the world, they fall far behind when it comes to our regulatory and business models that we have put together, not just the contract for difference, but plenty of other areas where we have set out in our building codes opportunities to be able to shift the dial on emissions and to create standards that are integral to being able to do this. The United States have taken forward now their Inflation Reduction Act. A lot of the focus now is on other countries. And we are in this global net zero race. You know, standing still means that we will fall behind. My Emission Zero Review set out not only 129 recommendations, but 10 10-year missions, recognizing that we need the certainty, the clarity, the consistency, and the continuity of policy frameworks, the 4 Cs that I identified that will provide a stable investment platform for investors to come here. And that stability also requires cross-party collaboration from a political perspective, which is why I'm keen to maintain cross-party consensus going forwards. But recognizing that the UK still has the chance to lead, yes, we're not going to be able to compete with the EU or with the States when it comes to the money, but the money is not always the most important thing because we can share an opportunity. If we look to collaborate, with the US on key technologies, if we look to share the opportunity to build networks with the EU, particularly around hydrogen transport and renewables, that is a prize that we should seize, because it will create jobs both in the States, it will create jobs both in the UK, it will create jobs both in Europe. We can all be winners, because ultimately when it comes to energy, there is more at stake here than simply achieving net zero or meeting our climate commitments. It is not only an economic opportunity, we are also entering a new phase in the 21st century where we are seeing shifting global priorities. And the opportunity we have as democratically like-minded nations is to work with the Global South, is to lead the transition, because there are other nations that equally will use the energy transition for other purposes. And we need to work together as business to demonstrate that economic growth, democracy is the model that is a prize worth having and is worth committing to for the future. Thank you very much.
I've been a big fan of Chris's for some years, not because he's a Conservative, not because he's a politician, not because he's an MP, but because he's got integrity. He calls it as he sees it, uncomfortable sometimes as that may be. And I can't thank you enough for all you have done in your 14 years in Parliament, because frankly, without people like you, I think we'd still be staring at our navels. So thank you very much indeed.